So if you haven't been here in a few weeks, we have been going through for our Advent series this year. We've been going through the theme of simplicity and just looking at how simplicity is found in the Advent story. And we've looked at we've looked at John the Baptist and the simplicity around like material things. We looked at Mary and the simplicity of self in the sense of like being integrated and not being like complex and divided. And this morning, we're going to be looking at another aspect of simplicity, because simplicity is one of those words where it has like a lot of different like nuances, right? This one has to relate to being like unadorned or plain. So if you have your Bibles, please turn them to Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. This is the like classic Jesus is born text, right? This is what Linus quotes in the Peanuts. So it's like it's gospel. My kids love the Peanuts. I wish they're here because it's like Ezra loves the Peanuts, and so it's like this is like on constant repeat in our house. So it's okay. Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken in the entire Roman world. This was the first census that was to take place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house in the line of David. And he went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. And while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in cloths, and placed him in a manger, because there was no guest room available for them. Okay, so like I said earlier, one of the core definitions of simplicity is for something to be plain and unadorned or lacking decorations. Like we can think like shaker chairs. Like if you're like into woodworking or like you like furniture, like shaker furniture is like quintessential simplicity, right? It's just like clean edges, no decoration, but yet like it is elegant and beautiful, right? Like I wish I had this is off the cuff. I wish I had a picture, but like there's something clean and elegant to simplicity when something is plain and unadorned and not complicated, right? With like extra stuff, which is kind of ironic. Speaking of, since Christmas is usually not a season that is a very plain or unadorned. Christmas is usually like the opposite. It's like, let's go maximalist decoration scheme. Let's just like pile on poinsettias, Christmas trees, wreaths, bells, angels, lights. Like we go nuts, right? We go all the nines, and it's kind of ironic, right? That a story that's so simple and like unadorned, like Jesus' birth was not very spectacular by any stretch of the imagination. We have filled it with all these decorations. Like even just if you take a moment and appreciate like our sanctuary, like 90% of the year it's like super plain, and yet Christmas we like load it up. I love it, and so And there's this like contrast here. I remember when and just kind of like another story to go along with this, like why we like maximize on Christmas. I remember I lived in Portland. How many of you? Okay, I lived in Portland, and one of the things that we always loved to go do was go to Peacock Lane. Have any of you been to Peacock Lane? Okay, so I see some people have been there. It is spectacular. It's a street that it's several blocks of people who decorate their houses, but to say that they decorate their houses is an understatement. It's almost like the movie Christmas Vacation with Chevy Chase, but like not quite like that. Like they don't like what? It's kind of like Kaiser Lights, but like it's more so. Because it's like they're elaborate is what? It is actually, here's the funny thing though, and this brings me to my point here. It's not mandated. On their website, if you own one of these houses, they're not contractually obligated to do this, okay? But they do it anyway. Now, why would you ask yourself, like, why would you go, I mean, maybe I'm kind of a Grinch, but like, I wouldn't want to go through all the effort to do all of that decorations. It seems kind of extreme to me. Like I don't mind putting up some lights. I don't mind even like, like a cute, maybe little like reindeer in the lawn. But these people they theme out they'll have like Santa's workshop, and they'll literally have like animatronic Santas and elves, and like their whole house is decorated, and they have like things coming up out of the ground, and then like the next one will be like a different theme, and like they have all these themes, and they're like, and you can kind of like I kind of get the sense that they all are trying to like outdo each other, right? Because I think that there is this desire, because there's the thing is, I think there's a social desire to keep up with your neighbors, to keep up with the Joneses. I mean, the Joneses aren't here. I'm sure that they have a lovely home. I'm sure they get this a lot. But like, I think like if I lived there, I would imagine that there would be a pressure to decorate. There'd be a pressure to perform. And I could have just imagined me like having this like debate with Heather if we lived on the street, being like, do we have to do this year? And she's like, yes, we have to. We can't skip Christmas. And then all year we would think about like, okay, like what are we gonna do? What's the game plan? What's the theme? And I could just imagine it being, I'm sure there's a competition. I am sure that there's a pressure. And you know what? I think that pressure to keep up or to perform at a certain level or be perceived as a certain kind of person, like that impulse is with us, not just at Peacock Lane, but like everywhere, right? Like, and I think especially this time of year, Christmas is kind of one of those times of year where that I think that kind of gets pumped up just a little bit. Like people, Instagram their gingerbread house, or like how cute their cookies are this year, and you're like, oh, like my cookies are really ugly, like, and then there's like other people who have like these like I made these authentic German cookies that took me 48 hours to make that I used from my sourdough that's 100 years old, and you're like, good for you. I'm gonna eat my ugly sugar cookies, but I think there's a desire in all of us to want to be better than others, is what I'm trying to get at. To have the nicest decorated house on the block, to have the prettiest cookies, to have the nicest things. And this is also used in marketing around Christmas time too, right? Marketers and advertisers know this, and so they tend to, like Christmas is a time where things like luxury goods are like, you see ads for the new iPhone or the new Apple Watch, or, rings and jewelry and all these other things. And it's like, and from watches to bags to outdoor gear to cars, like we have all these things that promises if you have this item, somehow you'll be smarter than other people, you'll be more beautiful than other people, you'll be more outdoorsy than other people, you might be more manlier than other people, like that. I think there's a lot of guys who probably buy trucks this time of year because they like want to be more manly. I think the truth behind all of this is this: we often hide behind our possessions, and I think our external appearance as a mean to lift ourselves up. Adornment, luxury is all kind of rooted in pride, or the particular desire to be seen better than we really are to others, or consequently, trying to convince ourselves that we are better than what we really are. Though this doesn't have to, this doesn't necessarily even have to be like luxury items, because you may be like, oh, I don't do that. I don't do that at all. I don't buy nice things. But it could be brands, right? Like we all have brands. I know when I was a kid, there are some brands that are superior to others because they're quality, like their usefulness. I'm looking at like Crayola versus the Rose Art brand of crayons. The Rose Art brand of crayons never work. They don't. But there's like the other part of it where like there are certain brands that it's like, and I think Apple does this. They're just a computer company, but they like polish themselves to come across as like you're somehow better or more elite if you have an Apple product. And you can just see this in their marketing. And I think during this time of year, we can all get caught up in this adornment, this idea of, and I think underneath it all is there's this thing about our pride that is wanting to be lifted up. Yet when we look in the Gospels, we see a story not one of pride, but of plainness. Of Christmas, we take time to remember the coming of our Lord, which is the King of the universe, the creator, sustainer of the cosmos, who was born in really unexpected ways. And rather than having a royal birth announced with pomp and circumstances and having like photos paraded around and having like a dedicated Instagram and TikTok page like celebrity babies today, his arrival was marked by utter humility and unadornment and stripped of all honor. And it's interesting because even in the Friends tradition, like there is a history around plainness, right? Like like when we look at the Quaker Oat person, like when we think of like the quintessential Quaker person, we think of like the Quaker Oat guy, but the thing though that what's interesting thing about like back then, that was just like average like workwear, like they weren't trying to do this thing, and my call to us today is that we seek to be plain this Christmas by putting away our pride. Now, what I mean by this, like that we seek being plain, I'm not saying that like we all go out and like never like that we all start wearing like black wool outfits with broad brimmed hats and like bonnets. That's not what I'm talking about. And there are some Christians who do that. That like I think that, but the point here, I think it's about our pride. And I think that even if you wear religious garb, there is a temptation to have pride in a religious sense, that like I'm going to dress in this distinguished way because I am holier than thou, right? And I think that Christmas calls us to humility. As we practice the humility of Jesus. Jesus, King of the universe here, right? God was born to working class parents, Mary and Joseph, when we know that they were poor working class people, but the fact that when they presented Jesus to the temple, their sacrifice, they offered 2 turtle doves. And in the Old Testament, we see that this offering was like the second lowest tier, right? That like if you were too poor to even do birds, they're like, you can just give some flour. So we know that they're not like super destitute, but they're not doing great for themselves here. They don't have a lot of extra. They're probably living paycheck to paycheck. And not because they're not using their money well. They probably just don't have things. And we see their humility in the fact that God chose somebody who didn't have money, right? And that's kind of the opposite of what royalty normally does, right? Royalty tends to be known as having money and gold and power and wealth and all these other things. So it's like you already start to see the irony or the kind of upside downness of Jesus' birth in this circumstances. And then we're also told that he was laid in a manger, which is basically a feeding trough. And I don't know about you, if you've spent much time in working barns. Feeding troughs are not nice. They're not usually something that you would want to put a baby in. So it's kind of like a desperate situation. Granted, we're kind of given some contextual clues here that Mary and Joseph, the reason why they had to be staying in a barn is because they didn't have room in the inn because everybody was in town. But I would also imagine that if you if you were a person with connections, if you were a person with wealth, you could probably have found a way to stay somewhere nicer, right? And then on top of this too, is that Bethlehem wasn't like, this is the other thing too. Bethlehem was not like, we think of Bethlehem as being like the city that the Savior was born in. It wasn't. It was kind of a podunk town. Like that was not like, it wasn't like, it was a little village that like was kind of obscure. I mean, they knew it wasn't obscure because it like came from David. So like the people had like, there's connections to it, but it wasn't Jerusalem, right? Because the thing is, we have to think of like, we think of cities primarily as metropolitan areas, like the Salem city area, right? Where we have all the sprawl. Cities in the Bible were actually like fortified and had walls. So when you think of city, think of like walled enclosed city. And it represented something different. And then the villages around that city kind of funneled their goods to that city. And the villages weren't walled. And so this would be like one of those villages that kind of like was kind of vaguely associated with Jerusalem, but like and you could walk there, but it wasn't like it was still pretty far away. And this is not a significant place. It's kind of like off the beaten path. Jesus's first Christmas, his birthday, wasn't glorious, spectacular, or luxurious in any way, and in many ways, it was probably all a little embarrassing by worldly standards. What do I mean by this? Imagine if, we don't really have royalty in America, so I'm gonna use the British royal family here. Imagine it would be like Prince William and Princess Kate giving birth in the back of a pickup in a Chevy because they couldn't get a room at Motel 6, right? And in some like town in Wyoming. You're like, okay, this is problematic, right? You're like, oh, okay. But I think that like when we kind of put it in those terms, you're like, oh wow, this is kind of scandalous. And I think this teaches us something about God, because Jesus, who is God and man, it gives us a reflection of his character. What do I mean by this? Because Christ was pre-incarnate, right? Like God has always existed. So he chose to choose this, right? He could have chosen like a different time to come or to different parents, but he chose this lowly person. Christ chose to become plain and simple, literally down to earth, right? He didn't, and what's impressive here is he didn't need to flex his status. He didn't need to declare to people his importance, and rather he rested his identity not on the external things, the things that we would normally expect, things that we would normally associate with a king. He didn't need gold. He didn't need furs. He didn't need a pomp and he didn't need pomp and all this glory, but rather, in why? Because he didn't rest his identity on the opinions of others. He didn't like on us. And he didn't even base his own opinions of himself like on himself in the in the incarnate sense. But what he cared most of all, the Son cared about the opinion of his Father. And as we reflect on the coming of Christ, it should make us reflect on our own lives. Friends' historical testimony on simplicity, like I said earlier, has manifested itself in different ways, though in particular it has been to avoid lavish lifestyles and flashy adornments, like getting rid of jewelry, and adopting a plain lifestyle. And this included, Quaker man, but then it also included like the way that they spoke. And this is why they use things like, so you might be like historically being like, why did they use these and thous? Grammatically, they avoided the use of the royal we. So fun little tangent here. Grammar tangent. We used to only be referred to the like royalty, and everybody else got thee and thou. And so they just basically did away with that, basically being like, y'all like everybody else, so we're just going to call everybody thee and thou, and it kind of upset people, especially people who were their higher ups, because the way, like, we don't live with a very distinct class distinction or social hierarchy in America. But back then, there was a very clear delineation of like who your superiors were and how you were supposed to refer to them, and how you're supposed to respond. Like I read a book recently to my daughter. It was called Popcorn in the Palace, and it's about this corn farmer who gets invited to go to England, and he tries to popularize popcorn. Really happened. And so they try to get the queen. They try to get an audience with the queen, Queen Victoria, and her husband. And so they eventually do it. But then there's a scene in the book where they talk about how one of the ladies in waiting come and give them, like, this is like their etiquette. Like, you need to bow and you have to do this and you have to do that. And there's a funny scene where the dad kind of like the guy who's the corn farmer kind of forgets it all, and he's like, I'm gonna go like walk right up to you, very American. But like this is just like, I think, hard for us to understand. But like if we think about it back then, there's a manners and politeness mattered, and it was a way to reinforce social level, like and in honor, but also shame, right? And so and I think we all kind of know this. And even in the Bible's time, in the biblical time, they were a very honor-shame culture. So your pride was very important. And something that we failed to recognize because of 2,000 years of history of this, back then, your worth, your social worth was not just given to you. There was the idea of like everybody was born in the image of God and everybody had a certain level of dignity. Like dignity was an accomplishment. So dignity was earned. So you would do something great and then they would give you dignity and honor and praise. You had to earn it. You just didn't have it. It was an accomplishment. And then you could be like, and then you can boast, being like, look at me. I did these things. I am actually better than you. But then Jesus kind of flips this upside down. And I think that the point here is we shouldn't just when I say we should become plain at Christmas, it's really seeking after the virtue of humility. Because the thing is, like I said earlier, you could dress up a certain way, and that could also be a form of pride. And nowadays, most Quakers don't practice plain dress because they recognize that there's more to it than just simply like what you wear. So that's why you don't see me in a broad-brimmed hat most days, or at all. Wouldn't you like to know? So we should seek to be humble. We should seek humility. But how do you seek humility, right? How do you live that out? What are some practical steps that we can do this? Because I could be like, don't wear makeup, and I think that still is too external. Because really humility is an inner virtue that kind of travels outward. And so I want to try to speak to the heart of here. So I'm going to try to give you some tips on how to move towards humility, because humility is one of those virtues that it's hard to pin down and hard to get at. And so because once you try to achieve, if you're I'm really humble, you're well, obviously you haven't achieved it yet. So how can we seek to be humble like Christ during Christmas? Rick Warren once said, and this quote is often misattributed to C.S. Lewis, and it says this: humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less, right? Humility is thinking more of others, right? If you are not a humble person, if you are self-absorbed, and if you struggle, and if you struggle with, negative thought, so sometimes people think pride is primarily about thinking better of yourself and thinking more grandly about yourself. I think for a lot of us, it isn't actually that we are, we're how should I say this? It's not that we have a problem with thinking too highly of ourselves. We actually have kind of a reverse pride where we're thinking of ourselves often, but we hate ourselves, which is still another form of pride, but it's kind of its inverse version. So it's and the way you can kind of get out of and we might think of this as on one hand, we think too much of ourselves, we're narcissists, and then on the other hand, if we're over here and we hate ourselves, both of them kind of exist on this pride continuum. The only way to escape it is really to become self-forgetful. It's to be self-forgetful. If you're so absorbed in yourself that you're thinking of yourself constantly, you're not a humble person. If you're always taking pictures, or even if you're being critical of yourself, it's still this narrow image. So I would say this: when we become too busy thinking about and caring about other people more than what we think, more than focusing on our needs, I think we'll be headed first in the right direction. And so what I mean by this, I think a lot of what we do is done for the opinions of other people. Let's just take a look at our social media pages, right? They're filled with pictures of our vacation, our fancy meals, our successes, and then we also just love to virtue signal in all sorts of ways. Through signs in our yards, our bumper stickers, what have you, what we wear. We do a lot of things because I think subconsciously or unconsciously we're trying to get the approval of others, and we're often thinking about what are other people thinking in this situation. But what if we stopped thinking about these things and really just focused sincerely on other people? One of the things that, if you've ever struggled with something like social anxiety, it's often what are other people thinking about me? But here's the secret: most people don't care about you. I'll give a real life example. I struggled going to the gym for a lot of time because I was worried about what other people were thinking about me. People aren't thinking about me in the gym. They're just thinking about what they're doing, their next rep. And once I could let that go, I was oh yeah. And just move on with my life. I think a lot of anxiety that we hold is because we're really just remarkably self-absorbed. Human beings, we're just self-absorbed. And we see this and this is just and some of it's kind of normal. My kids are like this. When you're at a certain age, you just kind of are you just think that the world kind of revolves around you. And I think that that's normal, but that's not true, right? Most people aren't caring about you, quite frankly. And I think that we would find much more satisfaction if we just started caring about other people and tried forgetting ourselves. And Jesus modeled this in his own life when he came to serve, not to be served, right? We see this in the night that he was with his disciples, where he went down and foot washed his disciples. He didn't care that he looked like a slave. He didn't care that he got dirty, because he was thinking about his disciples. He was more worried about them than he was of ourselves, and that takes work. So I encourage you this week to, if you find yourselves becoming anxious, maybe think about what are other people thinking, or if you're going to take a picture of what am I doing this for, and maybe focusing on the other people in your life and their concerns. Then we kind of lead to the next step. And this is probably going to be kind of hard to hear, and it's kind of the most painful, and I don't even like saying it. But I think one of the most effective ways to learn humility is to accept humiliations. Or I should say, embarrassing circumstances. Because there is only a fine line between humility and humiliations. You can even hear it in the word. They're very close to each other. Because what do I mean by this? Imagine just for a moment what it must have been like for Jesus, creator of the universe, the divine Logos, full of glory and power for all eternity, laying all of that aside to become a baby. And a baby in its fullness. I remember one time I think I was at the Portland Art Museum, and they're in their medieval section, and I was like walking through, and it was for a college, and I was like, da da da, and I was looking at the paintings, and I was looking at the crucifixes and all these other things, and I was arrested by this painting of Mary and baby Jesus, and what was so arresting about it was I've never seen a painting like this before. It was Jesus breastfeeding Mary. Like Jesus was breastfeeding, and I was like, whoa. Granted, of course, it's like if you think about it, you're like, oh yeah, like that would have totally happened. It's not like they had like formula back then. That was definitely happening, but it was so earthy. It just kind of like caught me off guard. I was like, whoa. And I think that the hard part was it was like Mary was kind of like unclothed and Jesus was there and he was latched. And I was like, this is just like, I don't know how I feel about this. And it made me really uncomfortable. And I was like, but it made me realize, I'm like, and then this is the other part of it too. In the background of the painting, this is where it gets weird. Jesus, there's a picture of Jesus in the background of him getting circumcised. And I was like, what is going on in this painting? And it's making me so uncomfortable. But the point here being is that it was to point out Christ's humanity, right? That like he truly lived a human life. And it was like God was fully human and experienced the fullness of humanity, including, and this is like, I think this is a really important part, as a baby, the dependence. Like, babies can't take care of themselves. Babies are kind of a hot mess. They poop themselves, they puke themselves, they can't do anything. They're gross. Babies are gross. If you ever fed a baby, it's not like when they're like I'm like right now in the season of like my baby's like feed, like Wendell, he's like 20 months and he's like trying to feed himself and he just gets nasty. I hate spaghetti. It's so awful. It's so gross. But this person is completely dependent and they can't take care of themselves. They can't wash themselves. And if you think about it, if you like, when we fast forward to life and we kind of go through the stages and when we become older, we start to lose the things that we became independent, right? Like a lot of us, we become independent and we have a form of dignity based off the fact that like, I can drive myself, I can clean myself, I can go to appointments, I know how to like do these things. I don't need help from anybody else. I am self-reliant. Yet, there gets to a point where that kind of goes away, where you need help from other people in uncomfortable ways. We need to, like Heather right now, she's a caregiver for a quadriplegic woman. And she has to do things for this woman just to clean her up. And like I think that is a struggle, right? To be dependent on another human being. And kind of like, how humiliating is that? Right? There's like, when we start to lose function of our body, it is vulnerable and it's hard. It's hard. And I think that there is a, we can feel the shame, we can feel the weakness. And Jesus, not only did this as a baby, he volunteered himself to be humiliated as an adult on the cross. We tend to forget how shameful crucifixion is. We sanitize the crucifixion. Jesus was stripped naked. He was totally naked on the cross. And that like even most, like when we look at even most crucifixes, Jesus has a cover I think that because it scandalizes us to imagine that Jesus like in his genitalia like hanging out in front of the whole world, so that we could gawk at his weakness and his frailty and his inability to protect himself. And he voluntarily chose this. He didn't have to experience any of this, but he did. He accepted, and I think he accepted our human humiliations for our sake so that we could become like him in the end. Embarrassments and humiliations are difficult to endure because I think it often hits our pride, right? because it points to our limits, our weaknesses, our inadequacies, and we just don't like to admit that. And I think that one way we can enter into humility is learning to be vulnerable with other people, being willing to admit our weaknesses, our limits, our doubts, our insecurities, letting other people care for us. I know that maybe you're one of those people who get sick and you're like, I don't want anybody to take care of me. Maybe you should just let them. I know that maybe it's opening space for people to be vulnerable in your life. Now, this doesn't mean what I'm not saying is that you should just be a doormat to let people abuse you with terrible words. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that you should just accept verbal abuse from people. That's not what I'm getting at. I think what I'm trying to say here is that I think that there's lots of things that sting our pride that come in the normal day-to-day life, and be willing to bring people into those things, or in just embracing them as a fact. Maybe it's stop dyeing your hair and accepting you're going gray. Maybe it's accepting you're going bald and just not trying to keep growing out your hair, right? Maybe it's acknowledging, that your inability to do something and asking for help. I know that you're I can't fix a car. Maybe it's calling somebody and asking to help out. I know there's a lot of people who don't like asking for help. Maybe it's finally admitting that you need to go to marriage counseling because you really can't help yourself. Maybe it's also saying that I have a problem with addiction and I can't fix it myself anymore. Maybe it's saying yes to that parenting class that you go, oh, I'm kind of in over my head. When we say yes for people helping us, it is kind of humiliating, but it is at the same time freeing, because you end up experiencing the love of other people. So even if it hurts your pride a little bit, maybe lean into it. And then I think finally it's this last tip. One way we can grow in humility is the practice of obedience. One of the clearest manifestations of pride is disobedience. So I refuse to acknowledge you. And ironically, disobedience, rebellion, and revolution are kind of heralded as virtues in modern Western society, in particular in America, because it's in our DNA, because we rebelled against the British monarchy. Now, I'm not trying to talk about, not to go over history, but I only say that I think that there is a strong impulse in America not to obey, to forge our own path, if you will. On the other hand, humility is always marked with obedience to legitimate authority, whether it be your boss or the government. And I love this quote by St. Benedict. It says this: "The first degree of humility is this, prompt obedience." We can understand our place when we show that we understand our place, and when we have the right to obey those who are proper authority to us. I think it shows us that we start fostering the reps of humility. And this is even modeled by Jesus. As a child, he was forced to obey his parents, right? To Mary and to Joseph. Luke chapter 2, 48 through 52. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? And your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know that I would be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. And then his mother treasured all these things in her heart, and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with. So Jesus models the fact that he grows in obedience, and even throughout the Gospels, the repeated phrase is that I only do what the Father's will is. Jesus doesn't have his own agenda. He models this kind of this humility, even though that he is co-equal with God in the Godhead. He chooses to voluntarily submit to the Father. So we should take time and think about how are the little ways that we can obey other people in our life. So take time to think about obeying your superiors and your authorities. So if you volunteer somewhere and you have a supervisor that tells you to do something, maybe do it without like fighting back. There's a time where you can maybe push back a little bit, right? Like you've had those times where your boss might be like, well, what do you think about this? But then like do it and don't grumble about it. Maybe it's saying, maybe, this is the other thing, maybe you read something in scripture that makes you feel uncomfortable and you have a hard time with it, and you think to yourself, oh, this doesn't apply to me for this reason and that reason. And within a reason, I think that can hold, like, for example, like, I don't think that, like, you have to obey the rule of, like, mixed fibered clothing, right? But there's other times where it says, like, love your neighbor, forgive other people. You might listen to that. Maybe it's obeying your spouse with something. Yeah, that's tricky. Like it says that, that we should obey one another. Maybe it's obeying your parents. Maybe it's, there's like all these different ways. Like you see this kind of this mutual submission and mutual obedience modeled by Paul in the letters of Ephesians, for example. Husbands and wife mutually are supporting each other, mutually obedient to each other. There is a hope in humility that doesn't exist in pride. It is this, that God, when we submit to be humble, God will raise us up. By willing to take a step back, we allow Him to shine forth in us, and it's the kind of the chinks and the cracks in our vulnerability that His glory gets revealed. Our weaknesses become a canvas for His glory, and that's where so then through those things, the real light of Christ may be shown. So rather than kind of adorning ourselves with accomplishments or handbags or the latest iPhone, let's seek to become plain by putting away pride, thinking more of other people, willing to accept, embarrassments, and be willing to follow rather than to impose our will. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this word. Humility is a challenge, and I pray that you would help us do this. Help us fight our pride, and in some ways, this is the hardest vice to overcome because it is at the core of kind of all other sins. Help reveal to us maybe ways that we can concretely live this out. In your Son's name, amen.